Hello there, and welcome to Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, to this quiet place where we can explore the past together. Before we begin our journey, take a moment to settle in, to let the day fall away from your shoulders. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? A darkened bedroom where the modern world feels far away? A cozy corner where history feels closer than tomorrow? Tonight, we're going to drift back 2,400 years to a moment when a single city became the centre of human achievement. Athens in the Age of Pericles, the 5th century before the Common Era, when democracy found its voice, when marble temples rose against an azure sky, when philosophy and theatre and art converged in ways that would echo through all the centuries to follow. We'll walk through the agora where Socrates asked his questions, stand beneath the Parthenon as it climbed toward completion, and understand how a small city-state on the edge of the known world became the foundation of Western civilization. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a lecture filled with dates you need to memorize or a dramatic tale of wars and conquests. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the streets of ancient Athens, taking our time with each discovery, meeting the people who lived there, understanding what they built and why it mattered. By the end, I think you'll find that Athens feels less like ancient history and more like a conversation that never quite ended. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the past, a like and subscribe really helps others discover this peaceful way to learn. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of curious minds seeking rest. So settle in now. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts quiet. And let's begin our slow drift through the streets of Athens, when Pericles walked its marble steps and the world was for a moment transformed. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, and let the ancient world unfold around you like a dream you've always known. To understand Athens at its height, we must first understand the ashes from which it rose. Picture the city in 480 BCE, just a generation before Pericles would reshape it into something magnificent. The Persians had come, the great empire from the east, with armies so vast they seemed to darken the horizon. They had burned the temples on the Acropolis, reduced the sacred sanctuaries to rubble and smoke, left Athens a charred skeleton of what it had been. The Athenians had fled before the Persian advance, watching from the island of Salamis as their city burned. But they had also won something precious in that moment of loss. In the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, the Athenian navy had destroyed the Persian fleet, turning the tide of the greatest war the Greek world had ever known. The victory at Salamis and the land battle at Plataea that followed had saved not just Athens but the entire constellation of Greek city-states from Persian domination. Now, in the decades that followed, Athens faced a choice about what kind of city it would become. The walls were broken, the temples were ruins, the treasury was depleted. But the Athenian navy remained the strongest in the Aegean, and with it came influence, power, and possibility. Other cities looked to Athens for leadership against any future Persian threat. The Delian League formed, an alliance of city-states that would gradually transform into something closer to an Athenian empire. This was the world into which Pericles emerged as a political force. Born around 495 BCE, he came of age in a city rebuilding itself, reimagining itself, reaching towards something it had never been before. The Athens of Pericles' youth was raw with potential, scarred by war but unbowed by defeat, democratic in spirit but still finding the shape that democracy would take. The ruins on the Acropolis stood as a reminder of what had been lost, but they also posed a question that would define the coming age. What would Athens build in place of what the Persians had burned? The answer to that question would take decades to unfold, and it would transform not just Athens but the very idea of what a city could be. The temples that would rise, the plays that would be performed, the philosophy that would be debated, the democracy that would be practiced. All of it grew from this moment of rebuilding, from the determination of a wounded city to become something greater than it had been before. And at the centre of that transformation would stand one man, born into the aristocracy but devoted to the people, a leader who would give his name to an entire age. But before we meet Pericles himself, let's understand the Athens he would lead, the mechanisms of democracy he would master, and the cultural flowering he would nurture into being. Pericles came from one of Athens' most prominent families, the Alcmaeonidae, a lineage that carried both prestige and a certain curse in Athenian memory. His father, Xanthippus, had commanded the Athenian forces at the Battle of Mycale, one of the final victories over Persia. His mother, Agariste, was the niece of Cleisthenes, the man who had reformed Athens' constitution and laid the groundwork for its democracy. Pericles was born into privilege, into expectation, into a world where his family name opened doors but also created obligations. But privilege in democratic Athens was a complicated thing. Unlike aristocracies elsewhere, where birth alone secured power, Athenian democracy required that leaders be chosen by the people, that they stand in the assembly and persuade, that they navigate the unpredictable currents of public opinion. Pericles understood this from his youth. He studied rhetoric with the sophists, those teachers of persuasion who sold their skills to ambitious young men. He learned music and philosophy from Damon of Athens, developing not just political skills, but a broader vision of what culture and education could be. Physically, Pericles was distinctive. The ancient sources tell us he had an unusually long head, elongated in a way that became a favourite subject for comic poets. They called him quote, _0_, comparing his skull to the sea onion. Artists almost always depicted him wearing a helmet, perhaps to hide this distinctive feature, perhaps because he served as a general, and the helmet became part of his public image. But if his appearance invited mockery, his oratory commanded respect. Thucydides, the great historian, would later write that Pericles' speeches moved the Athenians like no other orator of his time. Pericles entered politics in the 460s BCE, aligning himself with the democratic faction against the more conservative elements of Athenian society. His early years in public life saw him prosecuting political opponents, sponsoring public festivals, and gradually building the network of supporters and the reputation for incorruptibility that would carry him to leadership. By 443 BCE, he had been elected strategos, one of Athens' 10 generals, a position he would hold continuously for the next 15 years until his death. What made Pericles remarkable was not just his political skill, but his vision for what Athens could become. He saw the city not merely as a military power, but as a cultural beacon, a place where democracy and art and philosophy could flourish together. He believed that Athens' greatness should be visible, tangible, expressed in marble and bronze and the written word. He understood that a democracy needed educated citizens, that culture was not a luxury, but a necessity for a free people. In the assembly, speaking before thousands of his fellow citizens, Pericles articulated a vision of Athens that was both practical and inspiring. He argued for the building programs that would transform the Acropolis. He defended Athens' imperial ambitions as necessary for the city's security. He celebrated Athenian democracy as a model for the world, a system where merit mattered more than birth, where citizens participated directly in governing themselves. His influence was so profound that the historian Thucydides would write that Athens, though nominally a democracy, was in practice ruled by its first citizen, Pericles himself. And so this man, born into aristocracy but devoted to democracy, gifted in speech but marked by an unusual appearance, would guide Athens through its most glorious decades, leaving a legacy that would outlast empires. To understand Pericles' Athens, we must understand how democracy actually worked in the dusty reality of daily life. Far from our modern abstractions about governance, Athenian democracy was not representative but direct. Citizens did not elect officials to make decisions for them. They made the decisions themselves, gathering in the assembly on the Nix Hill overlooking the city. Imagine the scene on assembly days, which happened roughly every 10 days. At dawn, ropes soaked in red dye would be stretched across the agora, herding citizens toward the Nix like sheep toward a pen. Those who arrived with red dye on their clothing, evidence that they had tried to avoid the assembly, would be fined. Citizenship carried obligations, not just privileges, and participating in governance was the most fundamental obligation of all. The Pnyx was a hillside auditorium carved into the rock, capable of holding 6,000 citizens, though quorum for most decisions required only 5,000. Men would arrive carrying cushions to sit on the stone seats, bringing their breakfast, settling in for what might be hours of debate. Women were excluded, as were slaves and foreign residents. Democracy in Athens meant rule by the demos, the people. But Quote 1 was defined narrowly: adult male citizens whose parents were both Athenian. Perhaps 40,000 men in a total population of 300,000 held the franchise. The assembly debated everything: declarations of war, treaties of peace, public finances, religious festivals, construction projects, ostracism of dangerous citizens, honours for benefactors. Any citizen could speak. Though in practice oratory was a skill that separated the influential from the ignored, speakers would climb onto the bema, a speaker's platform carved from living rock, and address the crowd directly. There were no microphones, no amplification, just the human voice carrying across the hillside, competing with wind and the murmur of thousands. Decisions were made by show of hands, a forest of arms rising and falling as proposals were voted up or down. It was democracy in its most visceral form, immediate and sometimes chaotic. The assembly could be swayed by emotion, by eloquence, by the mood of a particular day. This worried philosophers like Plato, who saw mob rule in such systems, but it also meant that power genuinely rested with the many rather than the few, that a poor farmer from the countryside had the same vote as the wealthy aristocrat from the city. Beyond the assembly, democracy penetrated deep into the administration of the city. The Council of 500, chosen by lot from the citizen body, prepared the agenda for assembly meetings and oversaw the day-to-day running of government. Most officials were selected by lot rather than election, on the theory that any citizen was capable of serving, and that random selection prevented the concentration of power. Only the 10 generals, the strategoi, were elected, and even they faced annual votes and could be removed if they lost public confidence. Jury service was another pillar of democratic participation. Courts with hundreds of jurors heard cases, from murder trials to property disputes to challenges to the constitutionality of laws. Jurors were paid, a small amount but enough that even poor citizens could afford to serve. Pericles had instituted payment for jury service, recognizing that democracy required citizens to have the material means to participate. This was democracy as a living practice, messy and loud and deeply participatory, requiring constant engagement from its citizens. It was far from perfect, limited as it was to a fraction of the population, but within its limits it represented something genuinely radical. The idea that ordinary people, not kings or aristocrats or priests, should govern themselves. In 447 BCE, as Pericles' influence over Athens reached its height, a decision was made that would transform the city's skyline and its place in history. The Acropolis, that great limestone outcrop rising above Athens, still bore the scars of the Persian invasion. The old temples remained in ruins, left deliberately unrestored as a reminder of Persian sacrilege. But Pericles proposed something bold, to rebuild the sacred site not merely as it had been, but as something grander, a statement in marble that would proclaim Athens' greatness to all who saw it. The centerpiece would be a new temple to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, patron goddess of the city. This was the Parthenon, and its construction would take 15 years, consume vast resources, and produce what many consider the finest building ever erected in the ancient world. Let's drift back to the construction site in the late 440s BCE and imagine what we might have seen and heard. The Acropolis in these years was a chaos of industry. Marble blocks from Mount Pentelicus, 15 kilometres away, arrived in a constant stream, hauled by oxen and rolled on wooden frames. The marble was unusual, turning golden in the light of the setting sun, containing traces of iron that would give the finished temple a warm glow. Masons worked the blocks with iron tools, achieving a precision that still astonishes. The drums of the columns were carved to fit together so perfectly that no mortar was needed. Gravity and friction held the stones in place. Slaves and free workers laboured side by side, though the records that survive tell us the pay scales were essentially equal for equal work, a rare moment of economic levelling in the ancient world. The sound must have been tremendous, iron chisels ringing against stone, wooden cranes creaking as they lifted multi-ton blocks into position, foremen shouting instructions, the constant background noise of hundreds of men at work on a single monumental project. The architect was Ectinus, working with Callicrates, two names that would be remembered as long as buildings are studied. But they were not designing in isolation. Pericles had appointed Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the age, to oversee the entire artistic programme of the Acropolis rebuilding. It was Phidias' vision that unified the various structures, that ensured the Parthenon would be not just architecturally perfect, but artistically sublime. And what vision it was! The Parthenon appears at first glance to be all straight lines and right angles, the epitome of geometric order, but look closer, and you discover that there's not a straight line in the entire building. The columns lean slightly inward, the floor curves upward in the middle, the corner columns are thicker than the others. These are not errors but deliberate refinements, optical corrections designed to account for how the human eye perceives perspective and distance. Without these adjustments, the building would appear to sag and lean. With them, it achieves a visual perfection that seems almost supernatural. As the walls rose and the roof took shape, attention turned to decoration. The triangular pediments at each end would hold massive sculptural groups, carved in the round, depicting the birth of Athena and her contest with Poseidon for patronage of the city. Around the building's exterior, just below the roofline, ran the frieze of Metopes, 92 panels carved in high relief showing mythological battles. And inside the colonnade, running around the top of the inner chamber wall, was the famous Ionic frieze, 160 metres of continuous carved relief showing the Panathenaic procession, the great festival that honoured Athena. This building was being created not just as a temple but as a statement of values, a declaration of what Athens believed about itself. Every choice, from the proportions to the subject matter of the sculptures, reinforced the same message. Athens was favoured by the gods, protected by wisdom incarnate, worthy of beauty and permanence. And slowly, over those 15 years, the Parthenon took its final form, climbing toward the Greek sky like a prayer-made stone. While the Parthenon's architecture astonished, it was what stood inside that truly took the breath away. Phidias, the master sculptor whom Pericles had entrusted with the artistic vision of the entire Acropolis project, created for the Parthenon's interior a statue of Athena that became one of the wonders of the ancient world. Though it no longer exists, ancient descriptions allow us to imagine what pilgrims saw when they entered the temple's eastern chamber. The statue stood nearly 12 metres tall, the goddess in full armour, a figure of such presence that those who saw it reported feeling genuinely observed by divinity. The core structure was wood, but you would never have seen it. Over the wooden frame, Phidias and his workshop applied gold and ivory in a technique called chryselephantine. Athena's flesh, her face, arms and feet, was rendered in ivory plates, carefully shaped and polished. Her armour, clothing and the scales of the serpent beside her were fashioned from gold. 40 talents of it, removable plates that could be taken down and weighed to prove that none had been stolen. She held in her right hand a winged Nike, victory personified, offering it to the city as a promise and a reminder. Her left hand rested on a shield behind which a serpent coiled, representing the ancient earthborn king Erichthonius, connecting Athens' present glory to its mythic past. Her helmet bore 3 crests, and on her chest hung the aegis with the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone. Every detail carried meaning. Every element connected to some thread of Athenian myth or aspiration. The gold itself was a political decision, as much as an artistic one. Athens had grown wealthy on the tribute paid by cities in the Delian League, the alliance that had become an empire. Critics of Pericles, particularly the conservative faction led by Thucydides' son of Milesius, not the historian, argued that using allied funds to beautify Athens was essentially theft, that the money collected for defence against Persia was being diverted to glorify a single city. The debate in the assembly grew heated. Pericles defended the expenditure with characteristic eloquence. Athens protected the allies, he argued. The allies paid for that protection. How Athens chose to spend its own funds as long as it fulfilled its defensive obligations was Athens' business. Moreover, he suggested the beautification of Athens benefited all Greeks by creating a cultural centre worthy of Hellenic civilization. The temples and monuments attracted visitors, pilgrims and traders. They employed thousands of workers. They demonstrated what free people could achieve when they pooled their resources and their ambitions. The assembly voted in Pericles' favour, but the controversy over the Parthenon's funding never quite died. Later, political enemies would accuse Phidias himself of embezzling gold from the statue, weighing the removable plates to prove theft. Phidias, perhaps the greatest artist of antiquity, would die in prison or exile, his reputation tarnished by accusations we cannot now verify or disprove. The gold that made Athena glorious also made her a political target. But in those years of construction and creation, as Phidias guided the sculptors who carved the pediments and friezes, as he supervised the assembly of that towering golden goddess, politics must have seemed secondary to art. The Parthenon was nearing completion, its marble gleaming on the Acropolis, visible from ships approaching Athens' port at Piraeus, a beacon of human achievement rising above the city that Pericles was reshaping according to his vision. What the Athenians saw when they looked up at their Acropolis was not just beauty but identity, not just temples but a statement about who they were and what they could accomplish. Democracy had built this. Free citizens, arguing in open assembly, had chosen to pour their city's wealth into art and architecture. The Age of Pericles was entering its full flowering, and the marble was rising. The Parthenon was the crown jewel, but Pericles' building program transformed the entire Acropolis into a sanctuary complex without equal in the Greek world. As we move through the 430s and into the 420s BCE, other structures rose alongside the great temple, each adding its own note to the architectural symphony that crowned Athens. At the western entrance to the Acropolis, where the sacred way climbed up from the city below, the Propylaea took shape. This was the gateway, designed by the architect Mnesocles, and it was as carefully considered as the Parthenon itself. Imagine approaching Athens for the first time, climbing the sacred way and encountering this entrance, a building that was part fortress, part temple, with massive Doric columns flanking the central corridor and Ionic columns gracing the interior spaces. It was meant to inspire awe before you even reached the temples beyond. The Propylaea was never quite finished. The Peloponnesian War, which we'll explore in time, cut construction short, leaving one wing incomplete. But even in its unfinished state, it achieved its purpose, to mark the transition from the profane world below to the sacred space of the Acropolis. You passed through its columns and emerged into a space that seemed separate from ordinary Athens, a precinct of the gods where human achievement reached toward the divine. To the south of the Propylaea, On a bastion jutting out from the main rock stood the little temple of Athena Nike, Athena as Victory. Small, exquisite, built in the Ionic order with its graceful scrolled capitals, this temple celebrated Athens' military successes. A parapet surrounded the bastion, carved with a frieze showing winged victories leading bulls to sacrifice. The temple faced outward, toward the sea, towards Salamis, where the great naval victory over Persia had been won, a permanent reminder of the triumph that had made everything else possible. And to the north, on the Acropolis's most sacred ground, where an olive tree sacred to Athena supposedly grew, the Erechtheion slowly took form. This temple was architecturally complex, asymmetrical, designed to incorporate several ancient cult sites into a single structure. It honoured Athena, yes, but also Poseidon and the legendary king Erechtheus. Its most famous feature, the Porch of the Caryatids, wouldn't be completed until after Pericles' death, but it would eventually show 6 draped female figures serving as columns, supporting the roof on their heads, an architectural feature of such grace that it has been copied endlessly ever since. The Acropolis in Pericles' age was a building site for decades, a work perpetually in progress. But that progression itself was part of the statement. Athens was not static but dynamic, not resting on past achievements, but constantly reaching for new ones. Every year brought refinements, additions, improvements. The Panathenaic festival, held every 4 years with particular splendour, would process up to the Acropolis through an increasingly magnificent architectural setting. For the citizens of Athens watching these temples rise, there must have been tremendous pride, but perhaps also a certain anxiety. The cost was enormous, the political opposition vocal, the practical wisdom of spending so much on beauty rather than fortifications questionable. But Pericles held firm to his vision, and the assembly, by and large, supported him. They were building not just for themselves, but for posterity, creating monuments that would declare Athens' achievements long after the generation that built them had turned to dust. They could not have known how right they were, how these buildings would be studied and imitated and marvelled at for 25 centuries and counting, how the Parthenon would become perhaps the most influential building in architectural history. The glory of the Acropolis and the power of Athens' democracy rested on a foundation that is sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus on culture and politics, the silver mines of Laurion. These mines, located in the southeastern tip of Attica about 50 kilometres from Athens, were the economic engine that made Pericles' Athens possible. Let's descend into those dark tunnels and understand the wealth they produced and the human cost it exacted. The silver-bearing lead ore at Laurion had been mined since before recorded history, but in the early 5th century BCE, a particularly rich strike transformed Athens' fortunes. In 483 BCE, a vein was discovered that proved extraordinarily productive. The statesman Themistocles convinced the Athenians to invest the profits not in direct distributions to citizens, but in building a fleet of warships, the fleet that would win the naval battle at Salamis 3 years later. Silver from Laurion built the navy that saved Athens from Persia, and that navy in turn made Athens the dominant power in the Aegean. By Pericles' time, the mines were operating at full capacity. The Athenian state owned the mineral rights, but leased the mines to private operators, who paid a portion of their profits to the public treasury. These revenues funded the fleet, the building programs, the festivals, the payments to jurors and assemblymen that made democratic participation possible for poor citizens. Athens' golden age was quite literally built on silver. But the extraction of that silver required labour, harsh and dangerous labour performed almost entirely by slaves. Tens of thousands of slaves, perhaps 30,000 at peak production, worked in the tunnels beneath Laurion. The conditions beckon imagination. The mines were hot, poorly ventilated, claustrophobic. Tunnels might be only 70 centimetres high, forcing workers to crawl or crouch for hours. Slaves worked by the light of oil lamps, breathing air thick with dust and fumes, chipping away at the rock face with iron tools. The ore was brought to the surface and then washed and crushed in processing facilities, where water separated the heavier metallic particles from worthless rock. The washing required enormous amounts of water, creating a constant logistical challenge in the Dryadic landscape. The refined ore was then smelted, producing lead that was further processed to extract the silver. The entire operation was complex, requiring not just muscle, but technical knowledge, organisation, and brutal efficiency. The workers in the mines were property, owned by the mine operators or leased from their owners. They lived in barracks near the mines, fed barely enough to maintain their working capacity, dying at rates we can only guess at from the skeletal remains occasionally found in collapsed tunnels. There are no monuments to these men, no records of their names, no acknowledgement in the literature of Pericles' Athens of the suffering that made the beauty possible. This creates a moral tension at the heart of the Golden Age that we cannot ignore or explain away. The democracy that Athenians celebrated, the culture they created, the philosophy that asked profound questions about justice and the good life, all of it rested on an economic foundation of slavery so extensive that perhaps 1 in 3 residents of Attica was enslaved. The Parthenon's marble blocks were cut and hauled by a mix of free and enslaved labour. The silver that paid for it came from mines where enslaved men lived and died in darkness. Ancient Athens itself was not entirely blind to this contradiction. Philosophers debated the nature and justice of slavery. Some argued it was natural, that some people were born to be slaves. Others questioned whether slavery could ever be compatible with justice. But these were largely theoretical debates. In practice, the economic system of Athens required slavery, and challenging that system too fundamentally was politically impossible and perhaps intellectually unimaginable for most Athenians. And so the silver flowed from Laurion to Athens, funding the democracy and the culture we admire, built on foundations we would rightly condemn. It's a complexity we must hold in mind as we explore the achievements of this age. While Pericles transformed the Acropolis into a symbol of cultural achievement, he also oversaw a massive infrastructure project that was fundamentally military, the long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus. This construction project, completed in the 450s BCE, reflected Pericles' strategic vision as much as the Parthenon reflected his cultural one. The long walls made Athens effectively unconquerable by land, transforming the city's relationship with the sea and with its potential enemies. Picture the geography. Athens sits roughly 5 kilometres inland from the coast. Its port, Piraeus, was the finest natural harbour in the eastern Mediterranean, with 3 separate harbours that could accommodate hundreds of ships. But Athens and Piraeus were separate entities, connected only by a road that could be cut by an invading army, isolating the city from its naval power and its supply lines. This was precisely what Sparta, Athens' great rival, hoped to achieve in any future conflict. The solution was audacious: to build fortified walls connecting Athens to Piraeus and to the nearby harbour at Phalerum, creating a corridor through which supplies and reinforcements could flow even if enemy armies controlled the countryside. The project required building roughly 14 kilometres of walls, each perhaps 6 metres high and thick enough to resist siege engines. The northern wall ran directly to Piraeus. The southern wall, built a few years later, ran parallel about 200 metres away, creating a protected corridor. The construction transformed Athens' strategic position. As long as the navy controlled the sea, Athens could not be starved into submission. Food and supplies could be shipped in from across the Aegean and beyond. The city-state became, in effect, an island, its true connection not to the surrounding land of Attica, but to the maritime empire it controlled. This was Pericles' strategic vision made concrete. Athens as a naval power, dependent on and dominant over the sea. The long walls also represented a political statement about the kind of power Athens was becoming. Traditional Greek city-states drew their military strength from hoplites, heavily armed infantry composed of property-owning citizens who could afford their own armour and weapons. Naval power, by contrast, depended on rowers, drawn from the poorer citizens who could not afford hoplite equipment, but who could pull an oar. By committing Athens to a naval strategy, by building the long walls that made that strategy viable, Pericles was also reinforcing the political power of the lower classes, whose labour made the fleet possible. It was a democratization of military power that matched the democratization of political power. The Thetes, the lowest property class of citizens, became essential to Athens' defence. They rode the triremes that controlled the Aegean, and that gave them political leverage. They could demand pay for their service, participation in political decisions, recognition of their importance to the state. The long walls literally embodied the connection between naval power, democracy, and empire that defined Pericles' Athens. Walking through the corridor between the walls must have been a strange experience, a kind of liminal space between city and port, neither quite urban nor open country. Travellers, traders, soldiers, and sailors would pass through, a constant flow of humanity keeping the maritime empire connected to its capital. In times of danger, when enemy armies approached, refugees from the countryside could retreat into this corridor, protected by the walls, supplied by ships, able to wait out a siege that could not quite reach them. The long walls stood for nearly a century, until Sparta finally defeated Athens in 404 BCE and demanded their destruction as a condition of peace. When those walls came down, Athens' age of empire ended with them. But in Pericles' time, in the middle decades of the 5th century, they seemed impregnable, a guarantee of security, a monument to strategic brilliance. They were also a provocation to Sparta and its allies, a statement that Athens did not need to fight by the traditional rules, that it could build a new kind of power based on ships and walls and silver from Laurion. The tensions those walls represented would eventually erupt into the Peloponnesian War, but that catastrophe still lay ahead. The Delian League, formed in 477 BCE as a voluntary alliance against Persia, had by Pericles' time transformed into something quite different, an Athenian empire. This transformation was gradual, pragmatic, and ultimately transformative for Athens and its hundreds of subject cities scattered across the Aegean islands and the coasts of Asia Minor. Understanding this empire is essential to understanding both the glory and the ultimate tragedy of Athens' Golden Age. Originally, member cities of the Delian League had a choice. They could contribute ships to the common fleet, or they could pay a monetary tribute instead. Over time, more and more cities chose or were compelled to pay tribute rather than maintain their own naval forces. Athens, with its large fleet and its merchant marine, had a natural advantage in naval matters. It made a certain practical sense for smaller cities to pay, rather than trying to maintain warships they rarely used. But this shift from alliance to empire had profound implications. Cities that paid tribute rather than contributing ships lost the ability to operate independently in military matters. They became dependent on Athens for protection, and Athens, controlling the fleet funded by their tribute, gained the power to enforce its will. What began as a defensive alliance became, city by city and decision by decision, a system in which Athens commanded and allies obeyed or suffered the consequences. Pericles was both architect and defender of this imperial system. He understood that Athens' democracy, its building programs, its payments to citizens for jury service and assembly attendance, all of it depended on the revenue from empire. The tribute collected from allied cities, stored initially on the island of Delos, hence the league's name, but moved to Athens in 454 BCE, funded the very things that made Athens great. The empire and the Golden Age were inseparable. But empire carried moral costs that Athenians debated in the assembly, and that historians still debate today. When cities attempted to leave the League, Athens responded with overwhelming force. The island of Thasos revolted in 465 BCE, seeking independence. Athens besieged the city, starved it into submission, and imposed harsh terms: destruction of Thasos's walls, surrender of its fleet, annual tribute payments. The message was clear. Membership in the League was no longer voluntary. Similar fates befell other cities that tested Athens' resolve. Samos revolted in 440 BCE, and Pericles himself led the forces that suppressed the rebellion after a long and costly siege. Mytilene would attempt revolt early in the Peloponnesian War, with debate in the Athenian assembly about whether to execute all adult males in the city, a measure that was ultimately narrowly defeated in favour of executing only the ringleaders. The tribute itself was reassessed every 4 years, with rates adjusted upward when Athens needed more revenue. By the 420s BCE, the League was collecting somewhere between 400 and 600 talents annually, an enormous sum that represented a significant burden on the subject cities, but also made Athens wealthy beyond any previous Greek city-state. This wealth allowed Athens to maintain a fleet of 300 triremes, the largest navy in the Mediterranean, which in turn enforced the empire that generated the wealth. Pericles defended this system by arguing that Athens provided real benefits to the allies: protection from Persia, suppression of piracy, adjudication of disputes, access to Athens' markets and festivals. He argued that power required resources and that the empire was the mechanism by which Athens obtained those resources. In the funeral oration that Thucydides attributes to him, Pericles would famously declare that Athens was, quote, too, implying that Athenian hegemony elevated all Greeks by exposure to Athenian culture and governance. But there was no escaping the fundamental reality. Athens ruled, and others obeyed. The democracy that Athenians celebrated at home was built on the tribute extracted from cities that had no voice in how those funds were spent. The empire was the dark mirror of the democracy, the necessary but morally troubling foundation on which the Golden Age rested. And yet it persisted, sustained by Athens' naval power, by the benefits it genuinely did provide, and by the lack of any viable alternative. The empire in the Aegean would last until Athens' defeat in 404 BCE, but its contradictions between democracy and domination, between liberty and empire, were present from the beginning. For all the grandeur of temples and the complexity of empire, the beating heart of Pericles' Athens was the assembly, the gathering of citizens that met on the Nix to debate and decide the city's course. Let's settle into an assembly meeting in the 430s BCE and listen to the voices that shaped Athens' golden age. The assembly met in the early morning, with 6,000 citizens or more climbing the hill to the Pnyx when important matters required a quorum. The Council of 500, which had prepared the agenda, would present the day's business. Perhaps it was a question of war or peace, or allocation of funds for the building programme, or a proposed change to the laws. Whatever the issue, any citizen had the right to speak, to climb onto the beamer and address the crowd. In practice, of course, some voices carried more weight than others. Skilled orators, men who had studied rhetoric and developed reputations for wisdom or eloquence, dominated the proceedings. Pericles was foremost among them, able to move the assembly with speeches that Thucydides later reconstructed as models of political oratory. But the assembly was also where opposing views clashed, where critics of Pericles' policies could air their objections, where the chaos and creativity of democratic debate played out. Consider the debates over the building programme. Thucydides, son of Milesius, leader of the conservative opposition, attacked Pericles relentlessly for using allied tribute to beautify Athens. He accused Pericles of turning Athens into a tyrant city, oppressing its allies to fund its vanity projects. He argued that the gold on Athena's statue could be better spent on Athens' defence, or returned to the allies, or distributed to Athenian citizens. His speeches resonated with those who worried about Athens' imperial trajectory, who questioned whether beauty justified the costs being paid. Pericles responded with a defence that acknowledged the empire's realities while celebrating its achievements. Yes, Athens dominated its allies, he admitted, but power was the currency of security in a dangerous world. The allies paid for protection, and Athens provided it. What Athens chose to do with its own funds, as long as it fulfilled its defensive obligations, was Athens' business. And the temples and monuments did benefit everyone, Pericles argued, by employing thousands, by attracting commerce, by creating a cultural centre that elevated all of Greece. These were not abstract debates, but visceral confrontations between men who knew each other, who had competed for decades, who saw Athens' future in fundamentally different terms. The assembly could be swayed by passion, by circumstances, by the speaker who last grabbed its attention. This volatility worried aristocrats and philosophers who preferred more stable forms of government, but it also meant that decisions reflected the genuine will of the citizen body. Changeable and imperfect as that will might be, the institution of ostracism reflected both democracy's power and its capacity for what we might call political hygiene. Once a year, the assembly could vote on whether to hold an ostracism. If they voted yes, a second meeting would be held where citizens scratched names on pottery shards, ostraka, voting to exile whoever they considered most dangerous to the state. The man who received the most votes would be exiled for 10 years, not as punishment for a crime, but as a preventive measure. It was democracy's safety valve, a way to remove dangerous demagogues or potential tyrants before they could do real harm. Pericles' own political career demonstrated how the assembly's favour could be won and lost. He dominated Athenian politics for decades, but even he faced prosecution and criticism. Late in his life, after the Peloponnesian War began, the assembly would turn against him briefly, fining him for his conduct of the war. The demos giveth, and the demos taketh away. An ever-present reality in democratic life. What emerges from these assembly debates is a picture of democracy as practiced rather than theorized. Messy, loud, sometimes wise and sometimes foolish, but genuinely responsive to the will of those who participated. Thousands of citizens arguing about how to spend their city's resources, whether to go to war, whom to honour, and whom to ostracize. This was self-government in action, with all its virtues and vices on full display. The voices that echoed across the Pnyx made decisions that shaped not just Athens but the wider world, and they did so through words and votes rather than violence and decree. It was an experiment in collective decision-making that had rarely been tried before and would rarely be replicated with such thoroughness. The assembly was where Athens became itself, for better and worse. While politicians debated in the assembly and workers carved marble on the Acropolis, Athens experienced a cultural flowering in theatre that paralleled its political and architectural achievements. The dramatic festivals, particularly the city Dionysia held each spring, became occasions where tens of thousands of Athenians gathered to watch tragedies and comedies that explored the deepest questions of human existence. And among the playwrights of this golden age, Sophocles stood preeminent, a figure whose plays still speak to us across 24 centuries. Sophocles was born around 496 BCE, making him a contemporary of Pericles, growing old as Athens flourished and dying just before its final defeat. He wrote over 120 plays during his long life, winning first prize at the city Dionysia more than 20 times. Only 7 of his plays survive complete, but those 7 include some of the greatest achievements in dramatic literature: Antigone, Oedipus Rex, Electra, plays that have been performed continuously since their creation. The theatre of Dionysus, where Sophocles' plays were first performed, sat on the southern slope of the Acropolis, its stone seats looking down on the circular orchestra where actors and chorus moved. The theatre could hold perhaps 15,000 spectators, essentially the entire citizen body and many non-citizens as well. Attending the theatrical festivals was considered a civic duty as much as a form of entertainment. and Pericles instituted a fund to pay for theatre tickets for poor citizens, ensuring that democracy extended even to cultural participation. The plays were performed in daylight, beginning in the morning and continuing through the afternoon, with 3 tragedies and a satyr play from each competing playwright presented over successive days. The actors wore masks, large painted faces that made them visible to spectators in the higher seats, and that allowed a single actor to play multiple roles simply by changing masks. 3 actors, all male, performed all the speaking parts, while a chorus of 12 to 15 singers and dancers provided commentary, asked questions and created atmosphere. Sophocles' innovations in dramatic technique were substantial. He introduced the 3rd actor, expanding the possibilities for dramatic interaction. He developed scene painting, creating visual backgrounds. He expanded the chorus to 15 members, but his greatest achievement was in the psychological depth and moral complexity of his characters and situations. His plays didn't provide easy answers or simple moral lessons. Instead, they presented human beings trapped in circumstances where every choice led to suffering, where doing the right thing often meant violating other obligations equally sacred. Consider Antigone. Performed around 441 BCE, the protagonist must choose between obeying the king's law and honouring her brother's corpse with burial rites. Either choice violates fundamental obligations to the state or to the gods and family. Sophocles doesn't resolve this dilemma. He presents it in all its terrible complexity and lets the audience wrestle with it. The play asks whether human law or divine law should take precedence, what obligations we owe to family versus state, whether civil disobedience can be justified. These questions resonated in democratic Athens, where citizens constantly negotiated between competing obligations, and they resonate still. Or Oedipus Rex, perhaps the most famous Greek tragedy, a play about fate and free will, knowledge and ignorance, the pursuit of truth and its terrible cost. Oedipus, seeking to save his city from plague, discovers that he is himself the source of pollution, having unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. The play's power lies partly in its construction, the masterful revelation of information, but even more in its exploration of what it means to be human, to seek knowledge even when ignorance might be happier, to accept responsibility even for actions committed unknowingly, to maintain dignity in the face of utter ruin. These plays were not escapism but engagement with the most profound questions Athenians faced. They were performed during religious festivals, but they dealt with politics, ethics, theology, family relations, war, gender, justice, suffering, everything that mattered in human life. The masks the actors wore became symbols of something deeper. The faces we show the world, the roles we play, the gap between appearance and reality that Sophocles explored with such relentless honesty. Sophocles himself was a respected citizen, serving as treasurer of the Delian League and as a general alongside Pericles. He participated in Athenian democracy while also standing somewhat apart from it, observing and representing it in his dramas. His plays suggest a worldview that was simultaneously pious and questioning, traditional and innovative, accepting of the god's power while interrogating the justice of that power. When political business concluded, when the assembly adjourned and the law courts closed, Athenian men of means would gather for an institution that mixed social pleasure with intellectual engagement, the Symposium. This was not a symposium in our modern academic sense, but a drinking party, structured and ritualized, where wine, conversation, music and philosophy mingled in ways that tell us much about how educated Athenians thought and related to each other. The Symposium took place in the Andron, the men's room of the house, specifically designed for such gatherings. Couches lined the walls, each accommodating 2 reclining men. The guests would arrive after dinner, already fed, coming together specifically for drinking and conversation. A symposiarch, chosen by lot or consent, determined how the wine would be mixed, typically 3 parts water to 1 part wine, though ratios varied, and set the tone for the evening's entertainment. Wine was central, but drunkenness was structured and deliberate rather than chaotic. The wine was mixed in a large crater and served in cups by young slaves or hired entertainers. Between servings, the participants would talk, sing, recite poetry, engage in word games, or listen to musicians. The entertainment could be sophisticated or bawdy or both, ranging from philosophical discussions about the nature of love to banter about politics, to drinking songs whose lyrics have survived on pottery shards. We know about symposia from multiple sources, from the pottery that depicted them, from the literary dialogues set at symposia, most famously Plato's Symposium and Xenophon's Symposium, and from fragments of the songs and poetry that were performed. These sources reveal a world of homosocial bonding, where relationships between men were formed and deepened through shared drinking and conversation, where the boundaries between friendship and erotic attraction were more fluid than our categories easily accommodate. The institution reflected Athens' gender segregation. Women of citizen families did not attend symposia. The only women present were entertainers, flute girls, dancers, hetaerae, sophisticated courtesans, or slaves. This created a space where men could speak freely about politics, philosophy, and each other without the social constraints that mixed gender gatherings imposed. It was simultaneously a venue for genuine intellectual exchange and a reinforcement of women's exclusion from public and intellectual life. Plato's Symposium, set at a drinking party in 416 BCE, gives us the most famous literary representation of what symposia could be at their best. The participants, including the playwright Aristophanes, the general Alcibiades and Socrates, agree to give speeches in praise of love. Each speech approaches the topic differently, from the comic to the philosophical to the deeply personal. Socrates delivers a philosophical account of love as the desire for beauty and goodness, leading the soul toward contemplation of the eternal forms. It's an idealized account, surely, but it captures something of how symposia could serve as venues for serious thought expressed in convivial settings. The symposium was also where political alliances were formed and tested. In a democracy where persuasion mattered more than birth, where public speaking determined influence, the symposium was where men practiced rhetoric, tested arguments, forged the personal relationships that would play out in the assembly and law courts. Pericles would have attended many symposia, both as participant and host, navigating the complex social world where policy and personality intersected. There was a darker side too. The alcohol, the closed-door setting, the presence of enslaved entertainers created opportunities for excess and exploitation. Later in the evening, as inhibitions dissolved, symposia could become rowdy, even violent. Kottabos, a drinking game where participants flung wine dregs at targets, combined skill and intoxication. Komoi, drunken processions through the streets after symposia ended, disturbed the peace and sometimes led to property damage or confrontations. But at their best, symposia represented a distinctive Greek institution. The idea that social drinking could be refined into an art form, that pleasure and thought could enhance rather than oppose each other, that conversation between friends was itself a kind of philosophy. The word symposium literally means drinking together, and in that shared drinking, Athenian men explored what it meant to live well, to think clearly, to love wisely, to participate fully in the life of their extraordinary city. In a society that largely excluded women from public life and intellectual discourse, one woman stood out for her influence and her unconventional relationship with Pericles, Aspasia of Miletus. Her story, preserved partially in sources written by men often hostile to her, reveals something about gender, power, and the possibilities and limits of female agency in classical Athens. Aspasia came to Athens from Miletus, a prosperous Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, probably in the 450s BCE. The ancient sources disagree about her status. Some called her a hetaira, a courtesan, but this may have been slander from Pericles' political enemies. Hetairai occupied an ambiguous social position, not respectable like citizen wives, but educated and sophisticated in ways citizen women were not expected to be, capable of conversing with men on intellectual topics, present at symposia and other male spaces. What's clear is that Pericles, despite his aristocratic background and political prominence, formed a lasting relationship with Aspasia. He divorced his citizen wife and lived openly with Aspasia, even though he could not legally marry her since she was not an Athenian citizen. They had a son together, also named Pericles, whose citizenship status would later become a political issue since Pericles himself had sponsored a law restricting citizenship to those with two Athenian parents. The sources credit Aspasia with considerable intellectual gifts. Socrates reportedly visited her to discuss rhetoric and philosophy. Plato, in his dialogue Menexenus, presents Socrates as attributing one of Pericles' famous funeral orations to Aspasia's composition, a claim that scholars debate, but that at minimum suggests her reputation for rhetorical skill. Plutarch reports that she ran a kind of salon where prominent Athenians gathered, and that Socrates brought his followers to hear her speak. If these accounts have any truth, and we must be cautious, since they're preserved in sources sometimes hostile to Pericles and Athens, then Aspasia represents a fascinating exception to Athens' gender norms. She engaged in precisely the kind of intellectual and rhetorical activity that was normally restricted to men. She influenced one of Athens' most powerful leaders. She participated in the philosophical and political discussions that shaped Athenian thought, but she also faced vicious attacks from Pericles' political opponents, who used her as a weapon against him. Comic poets mocked her, and Pericles mercilessly. She was prosecuted for impiety, though Pericles successfully defended her. Some sources even accused her of influencing Pericles' foreign policy decisions, particularly regarding conflicts involving her home city of Miletus, though such accusations may tell us more about Athenian anxieties about women's influence than about historical reality. What Aspasia's story reveals most clearly is the contradiction at the heart of Athens' treatment of women. On one hand, citizen women were expected to remain largely invisible in public life, managing households but not participating in politics, philosophy, or public intellectual discourse. Their primary virtues were modesty, domesticity, and bearing legitimate children. On the other hand, Athens produced some of the most profound philosophical and literary investigations of love, gender, and human relationships, investigations that required thinking seriously about women as thinking, feeling complex beings. Aspasia existed in the space between these poles, not a citizen wife, but not quite outside society either, intellectually engaged in ways that challenged gender norms, but doing so partly because her foreign status and possibly her Hetera background placed her outside the strictest constraints on citizen women. Her relationship with Pericles was public and apparently enduring, but it could not be formalized through legitimate marriage. After Pericles' death in 429 BCE, Aspasia apparently formed a relationship with another prominent Athenian, Lysicles, whom she helped rise politically before his death in battle. This pattern, attachment to powerful men, intellectual influence exercised through personal relationships, was perhaps the only avenue available for a woman, even an exceptional one, to participate in Athenian public life. We cannot know what Aspasia herself thought about her position, what freedom she enjoyed or what constraints she chafed against. The sources preserve her as a character in stories about men, particularly Pericles, rather than as a subject in her own right. But her presence in those stories, controversial and contested as it is, at least opens a window onto the complex realities of gender in Athens' Golden Age. To understand Athens' cultural achievements, we must understand how Athenians educated their children, how they transmitted knowledge and values from one generation to the next. Athenian education was informal by our standards. with no state-run schools or mandatory curriculum, but it followed patterns that shaped young minds towards citizenship and cultural participation. Let's follow a young Athenian boy, girls received little formal education, through his educational journey. Education began at home, in the women's quarters, where mothers and nurses cared for young children. By age 7, boys from families that could afford it would begin formal schooling, though quote 5 is perhaps too strong a word. Schools were private enterprises run by individual teachers who charged fees, operating in rented spaces or even outdoors. Poor families could not afford schooling and educated their children informally, primarily in whatever trade the father practiced. The core of elementary education was literacy and numeracy, learned through memorization and repetition. Boys learned to read and write, initially copying letters, then words, then sentences. The texts they copied were typically passages from Homer, whose Iliad and Odyssey were the foundation of Greek culture. Every educated Greek knew Homer extensively, could quote long passages, understood the references that saturated Greek literature and oratory. Homer wasn't just poetry, but cultural memory, a shared reference point that unified the Greek world. Alongside literacy, boys learned music, primarily the lyre. Music education wasn't merely technical, learning to play an instrument, but also involved singing poetry, often Homer again, sometimes the lyric poets like Sappho or Simonides. The connection between poetry and music was intimate in Greek culture. Poems were sung, not merely read silently. This musical education cultivated what Greeks called music, not just music in our narrow sense, but the arts of the muses generally. The cultivated refinement that distinguished the educated person. Physical education was equally important. Boys trained in wrestling, running, jumping, throwing the discus and javelin, the athletics that would be displayed at religious festivals and that prepared them for potential military service. The gymnasium, where this training occurred, was a public space where naked bodies competed and where, not incidentally, adult men observed and sometimes courted the youths they found attractive. The Greek term for these homosocial bonds, paiderastia, literally quote 6, reflected a cultural pattern where established men mentored younger males in relationships that could be pedagogical, social, and erotic. By their mid-teens, boys from wealthy families might study with sophists, professional teachers who offered advanced training in rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and other subjects. These sophists were controversial. Socrates famously opposed them, but they provided the technical skills necessary for success in democratic Athens, where persuasive speaking could mean the difference between political prominence and obscurity. Learning to construct arguments, to speak effectively before the assembly or in law courts, to analyse and refute opposing positions. These were practical skills in a society governed through public debate. Pericles himself had studied with the sophist Protagoras and the musician Damon, receiving an education that combined traditional culture with innovative thought. This combination characterized the best Athenian education: deep grounding in Homer and the poetic tradition, rigorous training in music and athletics, and exposure to new ideas and techniques. The goal was to produce citizens who were physically capable, culturally literate, and intellectually sophisticated. But there were limits and exclusions we must note. Girls from citizen families received almost no formal education. They learned domestic skills from their mothers, weaving, household management, perhaps basic literacy, but were excluded from the gymnasium, from studying with sophists. From the broader cultural education that boys received, the assumption was that women's sphere was the household, men's the public realm, and education reflected and reinforced this division. Similarly, education was a marker of class. Only relatively wealthy families could afford schooling fees, musical instruments, time for their children to study rather than work. The democracy that Pericles celebrated was, in its cultural and intellectual dimensions, available mainly to those with economic resources. Poor citizens might attend the theatre festivals, Pericles' subsidies made that possible, but they lack the educational background to fully appreciate the literary allusions and philosophical arguments that educated audiences recognised. Despite these limitations, Athenian education succeeded in creating a citizenry that was, by ancient standards, remarkably literate and culturally engaged. The plays performed at festivals assumed audience familiarity with myth, history, and poetic tradition. Political speeches in the assembly referenced Homer, quoted poetry, made arguments that assumed listeners could follow complex rhetorical structures. Athens was a literate culture in a largely illiterate ancient world, and that literacy was foundational to its cultural achievements. As temples rose on the Acropolis and plays unfolded in the theatre of Dionysus, a quiet revolution was occurring in Athens' streets and porticos. Philosophy was being born in something close to its modern form, and at the centre of this revolution was a figure both celebrated and controversial, a man who left no writings but whose questions changed Western thought forever: Socrates. Socrates was born around 470 BCE, making him younger than Pericles but still very much a product of Athens' golden age. Unlike the sophists who charged fees for their teaching, Socrates claimed to teach nothing, to know nothing except his own ignorance. His method was questioning, relentless and uncomfortable, approaching anyone who claimed expertise and systematically revealing the contradictions and confusions in their beliefs. Picture him in the Agora, the marketplace that was also Athens' social and commercial heart. A shoemaker or politician or poet would make some claim about justice or virtue or knowledge. Socrates would approach with deceptive humility, quote 7 he might say, and then begin asking questions. Simple questions at first, soliciting definitions. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? And as the conversation progressed, as the respondent attempted to define these terms, Socrates would probe deeper, revealing inconsistencies, exposing assumptions, demonstrating that what seemed obvious was actually profoundly unclear. This method, which came to be called the Socratic method or elenchius, was both pedagogical and subversive. It didn't provide answers but forced people to think more carefully about what they claimed to know. It undermined authority by showing that even experts couldn't adequately defend their expertise. It was democratic in one sense, assuming anyone could, through questioning and reasoning, arrive at truth, but profoundly unsettling in suggesting that conventional wisdom was largely unfounded. Socrates' central claim was that virtue was knowledge, that people did wrong not from wickedness, but from ignorance of what was truly good. This claim implied that ethics could be studied systematically, that there were right answers to moral questions discoverable through reason. It also implied that most people, including most Athenians, were profoundly confused about the most important questions in life: how to live, what to value, what made life worth living. Around Socrates gathered a group of young men, mostly from wealthy families, attracted by his charisma and his challenging ideas. Among them was Plato, who would become perhaps the most influential philosopher in Western history, and whose dialogues would preserve Socrates' method and ideas for posterity. These young men observed Socrates question their fathers, the politicians they were supposed to respect, the poets whose works they had memorized. They watched authority crumble under questioning, and some of them learned to wield questions as weapons themselves. This made Socrates dangerous from the perspective of Athens' establishment. The democracy depended on citizens deferring to collective wisdom, on accepting the judgments of the assembly, on respecting traditional values and the gods. Socrates' questioning seemed to undermine all of that. When he asked quote underscore 8 underscore and demonstrated that no one could adequately answer, he seemed to be attacking the foundations of civic life. When he questioned whether the gods really cared about the sacrifices Athens offered, he appeared impious. Moreover, some of Socrates' associates had proven problematic for Athens. Alcibiades, brilliant and charismatic and destructive, had been one of his circle. Critias, who would lead the brutal oligarchy imposed on Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, had studied with Socrates. Whether Socrates bore responsibility for his students' actions would become a pressing political question, though Socrates himself maintained that he taught nothing and could not be blamed for how others behaved. But in the 430s and 420s BCE, in the middle years of Pericles' Athens, Socrates was still just one eccentric figure among many, a philosopher asking uncomfortable questions, but not yet the threat to the state he would later be deemed. He served as a hoplite in the Peloponnesian War with courage that his companions remarked upon. He participated in the assembly and once held office in the Council of 500. He was, in his way, a loyal citizen, though his loyalty was to truth as he understood it rather than to Athens as it was. His questions hung in the air of Golden Age Athens like a gentle provocation, suggesting that perhaps all the marble temples and all the democratic speeches and all the cultural confidence masked profound confusions about the questions that mattered most. What is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? These weren't rhetorical questions for Socrates, but genuine inquiries, pursued with a seriousness and rigour that made philosophy something more than clever wordplay. The philosophers who came after, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the whole tradition of Western philosophy, would work in Socrates' shadow, grappling with the questions he raised and the method he pioneered. But in Pericles' Athens, philosophy was still young, and Socrates was still asking his questions in the agora, one conversation at a time. We have explored Athens' achievements in democracy, architecture, theatre, and philosophy, but we cannot leave our examination there, cannot celebrate the Golden Age without confronting the institution that made it possible, slavery. Tens of thousands of slaves lived and worked in Attica, perhaps a third of the total population, producing wealth, building monuments, enabling citizen leisure. Their labour underwrote Athenian democracy and culture, and their absence from citizenship defined who democracies _9_ were. Slavery in Athens was ubiquitous but not uniform. Slaves worked in homes as domestics, in workshops as craftsmen, in fields as agricultural labourers, in mines as we've already seen. Some slaves lived in their masters' households, others lived separately and paid their masters a portion of their earnings. Some were educated and skilled, serving as tutors or artisans. Others performed brutal, degrading labour under conditions that killed them within years. The sources of slavery were varied. War captives could be enslaved, a fate that befell thousands during Athens' various conflicts. Pirates kidnapped people from coastal regions and sold them in slave markets. Some people were born into slavery, children of enslaved mothers inheriting their unfree status. Exposure of unwanted infants, a common practice, meant that some foundlings were raised as slaves. Economic desperation drove some people to sell themselves or their children into slavery, though this was less common in Athens than in some other ancient societies. Legally, slaves were property, not persons. They could be bought, sold, inherited, used as collateral. Their testimony in law courts was only admissible if given under torture, based on the assumption that slaves would not tell the truth unless compelled by pain. Masters had nearly absolute power over slaves, limited only by a prohibition against killing other people's slaves and a few sanctuary laws allowing slaves fleeing extreme abuse to request sale to a different master. Yet the lived reality of slavery varied enormously. A domestic slave in a wealthy household might live relatively comfortably, might develop genuine affection for the family, might even be manumitted upon the master's death. Such slaves appear in literature as trusted servants, nurses who raised children, stewards who managed estates. Their slavery was real, but it could be softened by circumstance and individual relationships. At the other extreme, slaves in the silver mines of Laurion or in the mills that ground grain lived in conditions so harsh that mercy was meaningless. Chained, brutalized, worked until their bodies failed, these slaves were consumed by Athens' economy and discarded. Their names were not recorded. Their thoughts and feelings left no trace in the historical record. They are invisible except for the occasional skeletal remains found in mine shafts, evidence of bodies left where they fell. How did Athenians justify slavery? The short answer is that most didn't feel the need. Slavery was so embedded in the economic and social structure that questioning it fundamentally would have seemed as absurd as questioning whether the sun would rise. It was simply how societies organised labour, how wealth was produced, how households functioned. When philosophers did address slavery, they generally defended it. Aristotle, writing a generation after Pericles, would argue that some people were natural slaves, lacking the capacity for full rational deliberation, suited by nature to be ruled rather than to rule. This was self-serving nonsense, but it reflected and rationalised attitudes that were widespread. The fact that most slaves were non-Greek, barbarians from Thrace or Scythia or elsewhere, made it easier for Greeks to see them as fundamentally different, naturally subordinate. There were exceptions, moments when the contradiction between democratic values and slaveholding became visible. The philosopher Alcidamas, in a fragment that survives, wrote that God made all men free, nature has made no one a slave. But such sentiments remained marginal, philosophical curiosities that didn't challenge the actual practice of slavery. For those of us looking back at Pericles' Athens, slavery creates an inescapable moral tension. We admire the democracy, the culture, the philosophy, the art, and all of it rested on the labour of people who had no freedom, no voice, no participation in the society they literally built with their hands. The Parthenon's beauty and Socrates' philosophy and Athenian democracy all depended on an institution we rightly condemn. There is no resolution to this tension, no way to separate the achievements from their foundations. We can appreciate what Athens created while acknowledging fully what that creation cost, can honour the ideas while condemning the system, can learn from the culture while refusing to excuse the slavery. History is not simple, and Athens' golden age was perhaps less an achievement of democracy than an achievement built partly on democracy's back and partly on the backs of those denied any share in democracy's promise. The glory of Pericles' Athens reached its zenith in the 430s BCE, but the following decade would bring catastrophe that no amount of marble or eloquence could prevent. In 431 BCE, war erupted between Athens and Sparta, a conflict that would consume Greece for nearly 3 decades and ultimately destroy Athenian power. And within that war's early years came a plague so devastating that it shattered confidence and brought Athens face to face with mortality on a scale that defied human understanding. The Peloponnesian War, as it became known, grew from tensions that had been building for decades. Sparta, conservative and militaristic, led a coalition of land-based powers. Athens, innovative and naval, commanded its maritime empire. When disputes between their respective allies escalated into open conflict, the entire Greek world chose sides. Pericles' strategy was to avoid land battles, where Sparta's hoplites were superior, and instead rely on Athens' navy and the Long Wall's protection. Athenians would retreat within the walls, import supplies by sea, and use naval raids to weaken Sparta's alliance. The strategy was militarily sound but socially devastating. Every spring, Spartan armies invaded Attica, burning crops and destroying farms. Athenians from the countryside flooded into the city, crowding into any available space, watching from the walls as their property was destroyed. The long walls protected them from siege, but they couldn't prevent the psychological trauma of watching their homes burn or the practical hardship of displacement. And then, in 430 BCE, the plague arrived. It came by ship, probably from Ethiopia through Egypt, spreading through Athens port and into the overcrowded city. The symptoms, as described by the historian Thucydides, who survived the disease himself, were horrifying. Sudden onset with fever and inflammation in the eyes, bleeding from the throat and tongue, unquenchable thirst, pustules and ulcers covering the body. Many victims died within a week. Those who survived the initial onset often suffered gangrene in the extremities, losing fingers, toes, even their sight or memory. Modern scholars have debated what disease this was: typhus, typhoid, smallpox, some combination of infections, or something that no longer exists. What's undeniable is the scale of suffering. Perhaps a third of Athens' population died over the next few years as the plague recurred in waves. The dead overwhelmed traditional funeral practices. Bodies lay unburied in the streets. Families who maintained proper rites and periods of mourning became fewer as desperation grew. The plague affected not just demographics but social cohesion and moral behaviour. Thucydides records that lawlessness increased as people concluded that they would die before facing punishment. Traditional piety decreased as people observed that sacrifices and prayers seemed ineffective. Some threw themselves into pleasure, reasoning that they should enjoy what little time remained. Others withdrew into isolation, dying alone because even family members feared contagion. Pericles himself fell ill in the autumn of 429 BCE, during one of the plague's later waves. He had already faced political setbacks. The assembly, frustrated by the war's hardships, had briefly removed him from the generalship and fined him. He had seen many friends and associates die. His legitimate sons from his first marriage had both died in the plague, and only his son by Aspasia remained. When Pericles fell sick, his illness dragged on for months, sapping his strength gradually rather than killing him quickly. The ancient sources preserve a story from his final days. Friends and political associates gathered at his bedside, thinking him unconscious, discussing his achievements, the building program, the military victories, the years of leadership. Pericles stirred and corrected them. His greatest achievement, he supposedly said, was that no Athenian had ever worn mourning because of him, that he had avoided reckless warfare and unnecessary deaths. Whether this story is true, or whether it represents what Athenians wanted to believe about Pericles, it reflects values worth considering. A leader proud not of conquest but of restraint, not of expansion but of preserving life. Pericles died in 429 BCE, probably in late autumn. With him died the Golden Age's guiding vision. The leaders who followed, Cleon, Alcibiades, others, lacked his combination of vision, moderation, and authority. The war he had begun with confidence in Athens' superior strategy would grind on for another 2 decades, ultimately ending in Athens' complete defeat. The plague recurred several times in subsequent years, each outbreak killing thousands more, preventing population recovery, maintaining a constant background of fear and grief. Athens never fully recovered demographically from those plague years. The confidence and optimism that had characterized the 440s and 430s gave way to something more anxious, more desperate, more willing to take risks in hope of decisive victories. History doesn't offer simple lessons, but the plague years remind us that human achievements, however magnificent, remain vulnerable to forces beyond our control. The democracy that had built the Parthenon could not prevent disease. The culture that had produced Sophocles could not cure the sick. The empire that had dominated the Aegean could not close its port without strangling itself. Power and beauty and wisdom all proved powerless against mortality itself, and Athens learned what perhaps every age must learn, that we are fragile, that our accomplishments can be erased, that death cares nothing for glory. Before his illness and death, before the plague's worst ravages, Pericles delivered what would become his most famous oration, preserved for us by the historian Thucydides. This was the funeral oration of winter, 431 to 430 BCE, a speech honouring the first Athenian casualties of the Peloponnesian War. While we cannot know exactly what Pericles said, Thucydides composed the speech decades after the event. The oration he preserves captures something essential about Athens' self-understanding at its height. The occasion was solemn. The bones of the war dead had been displayed for 3 days, allowing families to make offerings. Now they would be buried in the public cemetery, the Kerameikos, with one speaker chosen to deliver the eulogy. Pericles had been selected, an honour but also a demanding responsibility. He stood before the assembled citizens and spoke about Athens, about why it was worth dying for, about what made their city distinctive among all the cities of the world. He began, as Thucydides presents it, with a remarkable move. He barely mentioned the dead themselves. Instead, he talked about Athens, arguing that the best way to honour those who had fallen was to explain why Athens merited such sacrifice. What followed was both a celebration of Athenian democracy and a profound articulation of civic values. Our constitution, Pericles supposedly said, does not copy the laws of neighbouring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favours the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. Democracy for Pericles was not just a political system, but a complete way of life, one that trusted citizens to govern themselves, that rewarded merit over birth, that created equality before the law. He celebrated Athens' openness, its willingness to welcome foreigners and ideas. He praised the city's devotion to both work and leisure, to both military preparedness and cultural pursuits. We cultivate refinement without extravagance, he claimed, and knowledge without effeminacy. Athens, in his telling, had achieved a perfect balance, powerful but not tyrannical, wealthy but not soft, cultured but not weak. Most powerfully, Pericles articulated a vision of citizenship as something more than mere residence or legal status. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business, he declared. We say that he has no business here at all. Citizenship required participation, engagement, devotion to the common good. The private individual who ignored public affairs was not praiseworthy, but deficient, failing in a fundamental duty. He also addressed Athens' empire directly, acknowledging that it provoked resentment but defending it as necessary and beneficial. Quote 19 he proclaimed, suggesting that Athenian leadership elevated all Greeks through exposure to Athenian values and culture. This was self-justification, certainly, but it reflected a genuine belief that Athens represented something worth preserving and spreading. Near the speech's end, Pericles finally turned to the dead and their families. To the parents of the fallen, he offered cold comfort. They should have more children to replace those lost, and should take pride in their son's sacrifice. To the sons and brothers, he urged emulation. To the widows, he suggested that their greatest glory was to be least talked about, a sentiment revealing the gender norms we've already examined. By modern standards, these passages are jarring, even offensive, valuing state over family, public duty over private grief. But the speech's core achievement was to articulate a vision of Athens as not just a city, but an idea, a set of values and practices worth defending. Whether Pericles actually said these words is less important than that Thucydides, writing during or shortly after Athens' devastating defeat, chose to preserve them. They represented what Athens had been at its best, or what Athenians wanted to believe about themselves, a democracy that trusted its citizens, a culture that balanced power with refinement, a community that asked much of individuals but gave them dignity and purpose in return. The irony, of course, is that this speech celebrating Athens' greatness was delivered at the beginning of a war that would destroy much of what Pericles praised. The democracy would be briefly overthrown, the empire would be lost, the confidence and optimism would give way to fear and desperation. Within a year of this speech, Pericles himself would be dead, and Athens would be struggling through plague and battlefield losses. Yet the speech survives as testimony to an aspiration, to what Athens sought to be even if reality never quite matched the ideal. It reminds us that self-understanding matters, that the stories communities tell about themselves shape how they behave and what they value. Pericles gave Athens a story about itself, a vision of democracy and culture and civic duty that has echoed through centuries. influencing how later ages have imagined political community and human flourishing. If we could stand on the Acropolis today and look at the Parthenon's ruins, what would we see? The building still stands, though it has been damaged by time, war, religious conversion, and careless restoration. The roof is gone, the inner chamber is roofless. Many sculptures have been removed to museums, most controversially to the British Museum where the Aegean marbles remain despite Greek demands for their return. Yet even in ruins, even stripped of its original decoration and religious purpose, the Parthenon retains power to move and inspire. The physical history of the Parthenon after Athens' Golden Age is a story of transformation and survival. For nearly 1,000 years it remained a temple to Athena, though Athens itself declined from its 5th century prominence. When Christianity triumphed, the Parthenon became a church, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Parthenos translated into Christian terms. Architectural modifications were made, a doorway cut into the eastern wall, the interior remodelled to accommodate Christian liturgy, the pagan sculptures defaced or removed. When the Ottoman Turks conquered Athens in the 15th century, the Parthenon became a mosque. A minaret was added to the southwest corner. The building that had honoured Athena now echoed with calls to Islamic prayer, proving again architecture's capacity to outlast the particular religious purposes it was built to serve. The most catastrophic damage occurred in 1687, during a war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. The Turks were using the Parthenon as an ammunition dump, assuming that the Venetians would not bombard such a magnificent building. They were wrong. A Venetian mortar round struck the Parthenon, igniting the gunpowder stored inside. The resulting explosion tore out the building's central section, collapsing much of the roof and destroying some of the sculptures. The building that had survived 2,000 years of religious change was nearly destroyed by a single shell. In the 19th century, as Greece fought for independence from Ottoman rule, the Parthenon became a symbol of Hellenic identity and resistance. Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, obtained permission to remove many of the remaining sculptures, transporting them to London where they remain controversial possessions. Greeks see this as theft. British institutions argue they were legally acquired and are better preserved in London than they would be in Athens. The debate continues, unresolved. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, Greek authorities have worked to preserve and partially restore the Parthenon. Modern industrial pollution, acid rain, and the millions of tourists who visit annually all threaten the marble. Conservation efforts involve replacing damaged marble, stabilizing the structure, and maintaining what remains. A museum at the foot of the Acropolis now houses the sculptures that remain in Greece, displayed in the exact configuration they would have occupied on the building itself. But beyond the physical structure, the Parthenon has survived in influence and imagination. It became perhaps the most imitated building in architecture. Neoclassical buildings across Europe and the Americas copied its columns, proportions and pediment. Banks, government buildings, museums, memorials, all borrowed the Parthenon's language of columns and triangular pediments to convey permanence, authority, and connection to classical ideals. The Parthenon has been drawn, painted, photographed millions of times. It appears on currency, in films, in advertisements. It has become shorthand for classical civilization, for democracy, for Western heritage, carrying meanings that would have bewildered its builders. To modern Greeks, it symbolizes national identity and lost glory. To classicists, it represents architectural perfection. To tourists, it's a bucket list destination. To philosophers of art, it poses questions about beauty, proportion, and human achievement. What would Pericles and Phidias think if they could see the Parthenon now, damaged but enduring, famous but transformed, sacred to no god but visited by millions as if pilgrimage? Would they recognize in its survival a vindication of their vision, proof that beauty endures beyond empires? Or would they mourn what's been lost, the gold and ivory Athena? The brilliant paint that once coloured the sculptures, the religious practices that made the building more than monumental architecture? Perhaps both. The ruins of the Parthenon testify to both achievement and impermanence, both the possibility of creating beauty that transcends its moment and the impossibility of preserving anything unchanged. The building is simultaneously a triumph and a tragedy, simultaneously complete in its essential form and forever incomplete, forever damaged, forever being restored but never quite restored. And in that state, ruined but recognizable, damaged but dignified, the Parthenon perhaps reflects something profound about human endeavours generally. We build, knowing nothing lasts. We create beauty, knowing it will fade. We reach for permanence in a world defined by change. The Parthenon stands as testimony to that reach, that aspiration, that refusal to accept impermanence as the final word. It's a noble ambition, even if ultimately futile, perhaps especially because it's ultimately futile. While the Parthenon survives as physical ruins, Athens' literary and philosophical legacy has travelled through time more completely, preserved in manuscripts copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, studied and debated for 25 centuries. The words that were spoken in Athens' assembly, performed in its theatres, debated in its marketplaces and symposia, continue to live in ways that marble cannot quite match. Consider the plays. Only a fraction survive, 7 tragedies each by Aeschylus and Sophocles, 19 by Euripides, 11 comedies by Aristophanes, but these remnants have profoundly shaped Western literature and thought. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex provided Freud with the name for one of his central psychological concepts. Antigone's conflict between divine law and human authority has been reinterpreted in context from Nazi Germany to apartheid South Africa. The very structure of drama, acts, scenes, the unity of time and place, descends partly from Athenian practice and partly from later interpretations of Athenian practice. These plays were rediscovered and passionately embraced during the European Renaissance, translated into every European language, performed in new contexts with new meanings. Shakespeare knew the Greek tragedians, though only in Latin translation. Racine in France, Schiller in Germany, countless others drew on Greek dramatic models. Theatre as we know it, as a distinct art form with its own traditions and techniques, has one of its deepest roots in 5th century Athens. The philosophical tradition descending from Socrates, Plato and Aristotle is even more pervasive and profound. The Platonic dialogues, written conversations mostly featuring Socrates, became foundational texts for Western philosophy. Questions. Plato raised, about the nature of reality, knowledge, justice, beauty, the good life, remain active questions in contemporary philosophy. His theory of forms, his political philosophy in the Republic, his analysis of love in the Symposium, his account of Socrates' trial and death in the Apology and Phaedo. These texts have been studied continuously since they were written. Aristotle, Plato's student, systematized knowledge in ways that influenced every academic discipline. His logic remained the standard until the 19th century. His ethical works, the Nicomachean Ethics and Eudemian Ethics, continue to be central texts in moral philosophy. His politics contains insights about governance that political scientists still engage. His poetics established literary criticism as a discipline. Medieval Islamic and Christian philosophers studied Aristotle intensely, trying to reconcile his philosophy with religious revelation. The historical writing that emerged from Athens was equally influential. Herodotus, the father of history, was not Athenian, but spent time in Athens and was influenced by its culture. Thucydides, writing the history of the Peloponnesian War, created a model of historical writing as critical inquiry into causation, as careful attention to political and military detail, as sober assessment rather than mythological storytelling. His analysis of power, of democratic decision-making, of how fear and honour and interest motivate states, remains relevant to international relations theory. But perhaps the most profound and diffuse legacy was conceptual, the very idea that human beings could, through reason and argumentation, investigate truth, construct just societies, create beauty, live well. This idea was not unique to Athens. Other cultures pursued knowledge and justice, but Athens developed it with particular intensity and rigour, creating institutions and practices that embodied these values. The transmission of this legacy was not smooth or inevitable. Much was lost. For every text that survives, multiple others have disappeared. We know titles of hundreds of Greek plays we can never read. Philosophical works we know only through references in later authors. The library at Alexandria, which housed many classical texts, burned. Medieval monks who copied manuscripts selected what seemed valuable to Christian readers, allowing other works to fade into oblivion. But what survived because people in each generation found value in it. Byzantine scholars preserved Greek texts. Islamic scholars translated them into Arabic when Western Europe had largely forgotten Greek. Renaissance humanists recovered and celebrated them. Enlightenment thinkers found in Athens a model for rational inquiry and democratic governance. Modern scholars continue to study, translate, and interpret Athens' literary and philosophical legacy. Today, one can read Plato or Sophocles in dozens of languages. Universities across the world offer courses in ancient Greek philosophy and literature. Theatre companies perform Greek tragedies, finding contemporary relevance in ancient conflicts. Political theorists debate Athenian democracy's lessons for modern politics. The words spoken in 5th century Athens continue to echo, continue to challenge, continue to inspire and provoke. This is perhaps Athens' deepest achievement, not the marble temples that survive as ruins, but the ideas and words and questions that survive as living traditions, still capable of moving minds and hearts across vast distances of time and culture. Pericles could not have fully imagined this legacy. No one could. But in sponsoring the cultural flowering of Athens, in creating conditions where philosophy and drama could thrive, he helped create something that transcended his own moment and purposes. Words outlast stone sometimes. Ideas endure when empires fall, and Athens, long after its political and military power ended, continues to speak to us through the texts its culture produced, across all the centuries that separate us from that extraordinary moment when democracy and philosophy and drama converged in a single city. When we try to assess what Athens' democratic experiment means for our own age, we must resist both uncritical celebration and dismissive condemnation. Athens was neither a perfect model to imitate nor a failed experiment to ignore, but something more complex and instructive, a serious attempt to create a political system based on citizen participation, carried out with impressive sophistication, but also with profound limitations that should give us pause. The achievements were real and substantial. Athens demonstrated that ordinary people, not just kings or aristocrats, could govern themselves. The assembly made decisions about war and peace, about public finances, about laws and institutions, and did so through open debate and voting. This was rare in the ancient world, where most societies were monarchies or oligarchies. That Athens sustained this system for nearly 2 centuries, despite internal conflicts and external threats, suggests that democracy could be stable, not merely a transitional phase between more authoritarian forms. Moreover, Athenian democracy was genuinely participatory in ways that our representative democracies are not. Citizens didn't just vote for representatives, they voted directly on policies. They served as jurors in courts. They held office through selection by lot, on the theory that any citizen was capable of governance. This created a level of political engagement and competency that is remarkable. The average Athenian citizen had far more direct involvement in governance than the average citizen in modern democracies. The connection between democracy and culture was also real and important. The public funding that paid for theatres, that allowed poor citizens to attend festivals, that supported sculptors and architects. This was democratically decided. The fruit of collective decision-making about how to use public resources. The culture Athens produced was not aristocratic patronage but public achievement, creating art and philosophy that would outlast the political system that sponsored it. But the limitations were equally real and equally important. Democracy in Athens was drastically limited in scope. Women, slaves, foreign residents, the majority of people living in Attica had no political rights. Democracy was governance by a minority, excluding most adults from participation. This wasn't accidental but definitional. Democracy meant rule by the demos, and the demos was understood as adult male citizens only. Moreover, Athenian democracy coexisted with and depended on empire and slavery. The tribute from subject cities funded the democratic institutions. The labour of slaves created the wealth that allowed citizens political leisure. The democracy that Pericles celebrated was built on domination of others, both subject cities that had no say in how their tribute was spent, and the slaves who had no freedom at all. The quality of democratic decision-making was also variable. The assembly could be wise and deliberative, but it could also be swayed by eloquence over reason, by emotion over careful thought. It could make terrible decisions, like the expedition to Sicily during the Peloponnesian War, a catastrophic military overreach that cost thousands of lives and ultimately contributed to Athens' defeat. Socrates' execution in 399 BCE, voted by a jury of hundreds of citizens, showed that democracy could be tyrannical, that the majority could persecute the innocent. So what do we take from Athens? Perhaps several lessons, held in tension with each other. First, that democracy is possible, that ordinary people can govern themselves effectively if given the opportunity and the support. Second, that democracy requires participation, that citizens must actually engage with governance rather than merely voting occasionally. Third, that democracy is always incomplete, always excluding someone, always carrying moral debts and contradictions that we must acknowledge and address. Perhaps most importantly, Athens shows us that democracy is not a simple good that solves all problems, but a perpetual experiment, requiring constant work, constant vigilance, constant willingness to question and reform. The Athenians invented democracy in part through trial and error, through reforms and constitutional changes, through learning from failures. Their democracy was not handed down complete, but constructed through practice, and it remained imperfect throughout its existence. We inherit from Athens not a blueprint to copy, but questions to wrestle with. How do we balance majority rule with protection of minorities? How do we ensure meaningful participation when communities are far larger than Athens? How do we address the economic inequalities that can make formal political equality meaningless? How do we prevent democracy from becoming rule by whoever speaks most persuasively, rather than rule through genuine deliberation about the common good? These questions don't have simple answers, but Athens shows us that asking them seriously, that attempting to create political systems based on human freedom and equality, that trusting citizens with governance, these things are possible and worthwhile, even when the execution is imperfect, even when the contradictions are glaring. Democracy is not the end of history, but one form of human organisation among others, with distinctive virtues and vices, requiring constant work to maintain and improve. One of the most distinctive features of Pericles' Athens was its commitment to beauty as a public good, as something worth spending collective resources to achieve. The building programme that transformed the Acropolis was not merely religious or practical, but aesthetic, a statement that beauty mattered, that creating magnificent art and architecture was a legitimate purpose for a democracy. This connection between politics and aesthetics deserves our contemplation. In most ancient societies, monumental architecture served rulers' glorification. Egyptian pyramids honoured pharaohs. Mesopotamian ziggurats celebrated kings and gods, but the Parthenon, though dedicated to Athena, primarily celebrated Athens itself, the democratic community that had voted to build it. It was paid for by public funds, decided by democratic assembly, accessible to all citizens during festivals. It was, in a real sense, the people's building. This represented a distinctive claim that a democratic community could and should create beauty, that aesthetics were not merely private luxury for the wealthy, but public necessity for everyone. Pericles argued for this explicitly, defending the building programme's costs by pointing to the cultural benefits, the employment it provided, the sense of collective achievement it fostered. He understood that communities need more than military defence and economic prosperity. They need meaning, identity, shared symbols, and spaces that embody their values. The beauty Athens created was not escapist, but engaged. Not retreating from political reality, but expressing it. The Parthenon's frieze showed the Panathenaic procession, citizens participating in religious festival, democracy in action. The plays performed at the Dionysia dealt with politics, ethics, war, justice, the same issues the assembly debated. Art and politics were not separate spheres but interpenetrating dimensions of civic life. This integration of aesthetics and politics might seem strange to us, accustomed as we are to separating art and governance into distinct domains. We tend to think of beauty as subjective, personal, a matter of individual taste, while politics is public, collective, concerned with power and interest. But Athens suggests a different possibility, that communities can and should make collective commitments about beauty, can devote public resources to creating art and architecture that expresses shared values and aspirations. There's risk in this, of course. State-sponsored art can become propaganda. Collective aesthetic judgments can impose conformity, suppressing innovation and dissent. The very thing we admire about Athens' building programme, that it expressed democratic decision-making, could also become oppressive if the majority's aesthetic preferences become mandatory. But there's also something compelling about the idea that beauty matters enough to be a public priority, that creating spaces and objects of extraordinary aesthetic power is worth collective effort and expense. Consider what public architecture expresses about a society's values: buildings that prioritise efficiency over beauty, that reduce cost without regard for aesthetic quality, that treat the built environment as purely functional. These choices express values just as surely as the Parthenon did. They say that efficiency matters more than beauty, that economic calculation should dominate aesthetic consideration. Athens suggests an alternative, that beauty is not merely decorative but essential. Not luxury, but necessity, part of what makes life fully human rather than merely functional. The Athenians walking through the Propylaea, seeing the Parthenon rising above them, participating in festivals within these magnificent spaces, they experience beauty as a collective achievement, as something that belonged to them not as individuals but as citizens. This had political implications beyond the immediate aesthetic experience. Shared beauty creates shared identity. Bond citizens to their community through something more than mere interest or obligation. It creates pride, attachment, a sense that this place, this community, is worth defending and improving. The Athenian who watched the Parthenon rise during the 440s and 430s had a stake in Athens that went beyond political rights or economic interests. They had an emotional and aesthetic investment in the city itself. Of course. We must remember that this public beauty was built on tribute from unwilling allies and labour from slaves. The aesthetic achievement cannot be separated from the moral compromises that made it possible. But recognising the compromises doesn't negate the achievement. It complicates it, makes it more truthful, more human in its mixture of noble aspiration and ignoble means. What Athens teaches us, perhaps, is that beauty is political, that aesthetic choices are never merely personal, but always connected to larger questions about how we want to live together, what we value, what we're willing to devote collective resources toward achieving. The question isn't whether to connect beauty and politics, but how to do so in ways that respect freedom, that encourage innovation, that don't impose rigid conformity while still allowing for shared aesthetic ambitions. In an age when public architecture is often dreary, when shared spaces are designed for surveillance and efficiency rather than beauty, when aesthetic considerations are dismissed as frivolous luxuries, Athens reminds us that previous ages thought differently, that communities once believed beauty mattered enough to make it a priority, even at considerable cost. We need not accept their specific solutions or ignore their moral failings to appreciate their basic insight, that human communities need beauty, need spaces and objects that inspire and elevate, need art that speaks to something beyond mere utility. One of the most intriguing aspects of Athens' intellectual culture was the connection its thinkers made between political life and cosmic order, between citizenship and philosophy, between the very small concerns of one city-state and the largest questions about the universe itself. This connection reached its fullest expression in Plato and Aristotle, but it was present earlier in the culture that Pericles helped create. Consider how Athenians thought about their place in the world. They were citizens of a particular city, Athens, with particular laws and customs and gods. But they were also participants in a larger Greek culture, speakers of Greek, heirs to Homer and Hesiod, connected through religion and myth and language to other Greeks across the Mediterranean. And beyond that, they were human beings, participants in a natural order governed by comprehensible laws, capable of understanding truth through reason. These different levels of identity and belonging weren't necessarily in tension. Being a good Athenian and being a good human, pursuing the interests of one city and pursuing universal truth, these could be complementary rather than contradictory. Or at least philosophers tried to make them complementary, sought to show that Athens' laws and customs reflected or approximated natural justice, that participating in Athenian democracy was training for philosophical contemplation of the good. The Socratic tradition particularly emphasized this connection. Socrates insisted that the examined life, the philosophical life devoted to questioning and understanding, was the only life worth living. But he also served as a citizen, fought in battles, participated in the assembly and council. His philosophy wasn't retreat from civic life, but engagement with its fundamental questions. What is justice? What makes laws legitimate? How should we live together? Plato would develop this into a full-scale political philosophy in the Republic, arguing that the ideal city-state should be governed by philosopher kings, people who understood the forms, eternal truths about justice and goodness and beauty. The connection between knowledge and governance, between understanding cosmic truth and organising political life, was central to his vision. A just city would reflect cosmic order, would organise itself according to reason rather than mere custom or interest. Aristotle approached the question differently but with similar ambitions. In his Politics, he analysed different constitutions, trying to understand which forms of government suited which circumstances, what made laws just, how communities could be organised to promote human flourishing. His ethical philosophy, centred on eudaimonia, flourishing or the good life, connected individual virtue to political participation. Human beings were political animals, he argued. We achieve our full potential only in communities, through engagement with others in the pursuit of common goods. This wasn't merely abstract philosophy, but reflected something about how Athenians actually experienced civic life. Participating in the assembly wasn't just voting on policies, but engaging in collective deliberation about how to live together. Serving on juries wasn't just administering justice, but thinking about what justice required. Going to the theatre wasn't just entertainment, but collective reflection on the great questions of human existence. The integration wasn't perfect, of course. Many Athenians participated in civic life without much philosophical reflection. Many philosophers questioned whether democracy was actually the best form of government. Socrates himself would be executed by democratic Athens, martyred to philosophy by the very citizens he had tried to enlighten. The tension between philosophy and democracy, between the pursuit of truth and collective decision-making, between individual wisdom and majority rule, these tensions remained unresolved. But the attempt itself, the effort to connect citizenship and cosmos, to see political participation as connected to larger questions about justice and truth and human flourishing, represents something valuable. It suggests that politics isn't merely about power and interest, but about meaning. That how we organise our collective life matters not just practically, but philosophically. That citizenship can be a form of wisdom. In our own age, we tend to separate these domains more completely. Politics is one thing, philosophy another, cosmic questions about truth and justice distinct from practical questions about governance. But perhaps we've lost something in this separation, lost some of the seriousness and depth that Athens brought to political life by connecting it to larger questions about how humans should live. Athens reminds us that political questions are philosophical questions, that democracy requires not just institutions and procedures, but citizens who think seriously about justice, who understand that collective decision-making is a form of ethical inquiry, who see participation in public life as connected to the pursuit of truth and goodness. Whether we can recover this connection without Athens' exclusions and hierarchies remains an open question, but the attempt seems worthwhile. The cosmos that the Greeks contemplated was orderly, governed by natural laws, comprehensible to human reason. The polis they tried to create was an attempt to reflect that cosmic order in political form, to organise human life according to reason and justice rather than mere force. They didn't fully succeed, perhaps the attempt was hubristic from the start, but in the trying they created something remarkable, a political culture that took ideas seriously, that believed collective life should be guided by wisdom, that connected the citizen to the cosmos through the mediating structure of the well-ordered city. As we near the end of our exploration of Pericles' Athens, we must return to the contradictions and moral shadows that we've touched on throughout, but that deserve deeper contemplation. The glory of Athens was real, but it was not simple or pure. It was built on foundations that we rightly find troubling. Sustained by practices that contradict the very values we admire Athens for articulating. How do we hold these two truths together? The most glaring contradiction is between democracy and slavery. Athens created a political system based on the radical idea that citizens should govern themselves, that power should be shared rather than concentrated, that every citizen's voice mattered in the assembly and the law courts. Yet this democracy depended absolutely on the labour of tens of thousands of slaves who had no voice, no freedom, no participation in the system they supported. The very men who debated justice in the assembly owned other human beings as property. This isn't a peripheral fact about Athens, but a central one. The leisure that allowed citizens to participate in politics, the wealth that funded public buildings and festivals, the basic operation of households and workshops, all of it depended on slavery. Democracy and slavery weren't contradictory systems that somehow coexisted, but were in Athens symbiotically linked. The democracy required slavery to function as it did, similarly with empire. The democracy that Pericles celebrated at home was built on the domination of hundreds of cities abroad. The tribute that Athens extracted from unwilling subjects funded the very institutions of democracy, the very buildings we admire. Athenian freedom was purchased in significant part with the subordination of others. The democracy was simultaneously a liberator, freeing Athenian citizens from tyranny, and an oppressor, denying freedom to those outside its borders and those within them who were not citizens. The exclusion of women from political life was similarly central rather than peripheral. Democracy meant rule by the demos, but the demos was defined to exclude half the population. Women managed households, bore children who would be citizens, participated in religious rituals, but had no voice in the assembly, no right to vote or hold office, no participation in the political life that defined Athens' identity. The democracy was explicitly gendered, male citizenship dependent partly on the subordination of women. How do we make sense of these contradictions? One approach is to simply condemn Athens, to say that any achievements built on slavery and empire and gender exclusion are too morally compromised to celebrate. From this perspective, the Golden Age is revealed as deeply tarnished, the democracy as hypocrisy. Pericles' celebrated Athens as a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-delusion and moral blindness. Another approach is to contextualize, to note that slavery and empire and gender hierarchies were nearly universal in the ancient world, that Athens should be judged by the standards of its time rather than ours. From this perspective, Athens' achievement in creating democracy, however limited, was genuinely remarkable, a step forward from the tyrannies and oligarchies that were the alternatives. But perhaps neither of these approaches is quite right. Perhaps what we need is to hold both truths simultaneously, that Athens created something genuinely valuable and worth studying, and that this creation was deeply compromised and built on moral foundations we must reject. The democracy was real, citizen participation was real, political equality among citizens was real, the cultural achievements were real, and the slavery was real, the empire was real, the exclusions were real. Understanding history requires this kind of moral complexity. This refusal of simple narratives of pure progress or total condemnation. Athens was neither the golden age of perfect democracy, nor simply a slave society masquerading as free. It was both, a place where some people experienced genuine political freedom and meaningful participation in governance, and a place where that freedom depended on the unfreedom of others. This has implications for how we think about democracy today. We inherit from Athens not a perfect model, but a flawed experiment. Not a system to replicate, but ideas to adapt and extend. The challenge is to preserve what was valuable, the commitment to political equality, the belief in citizen participation, the connection between freedom and culture, while rejecting what was indefensible, the slavery, the empire, the gender exclusions. Modern democracies have, in theory at least, extended citizenship more broadly than Athens ever imagined. We no longer accept slavery. We've expanded the franchise to women and to previously excluded groups. We've mostly rejected empire in favour of self-determination. These are genuine achievements, extensions of democratic principles beyond where Athens took them. But we've also, in some ways, retreated from Athens' democratic ambitions. Our democracy is more representative than participatory, more about voting for leaders than making decisions ourselves. We've separated civic participation from cultural life in ways Athens didn't. We've accepted levels of economic inequality that undermine political equality in practice, if not in principle. We have our own moral shadows. Perhaps what Athens teaches, ultimately, is that building just and free societies is never finished, never complete, always requiring vigilance against the ways freedom can coexist with unfreedom, the ways our highest achievements can rest on moral compromises we prefer not to acknowledge. The glory of Athens was real, and so were its sins. Both are part of the legacy, both worth remembering, both instructive for our own attempts to create political communities worthy of human dignity. As we reach the end of our long journey through Pericles' Athens, let's step back and contemplate what this city, this moment in history, continues to offer us across the vast distance of time that separates us from it. Athens speaks to us still, but what exactly is it saying? What wisdom, what warnings, what possibilities does it whisper to those willing to listen? Perhaps first, Athens reminds us that human communities can create extraordinary beauty and meaning, can build institutions and cultures that transcend their immediate moment and speak to future ages. The Parthenon still moves us. Sophocles' plays still challenge us. Socrates' questions still provoke us. These achievements were not inevitable or natural, but the product of human choice, creativity, and effort, made possible by specific conditions but also requiring vision and commitment to realize. This suggests something hopeful about human potential, that we're capable of creating things that matter, that endure, that elevate rather than merely serving immediate needs. In an age often characterized by cynicism about politics and culture, by acceptance that everything is merely power and interest, Athens offers a counterexample, a city where people genuinely believed that beauty and wisdom and justice mattered, and created institutions and art that embodied those beliefs. But Athens also reminds us that our greatest achievements are always compromised, always resting on foundations that future ages may judge harshly. Every age has its moral blind spots, its forms of oppression. It doesn't fully see or acknowledge. Its ways of excluding or exploiting that seem natural and necessary at the time, but that later generations recognize as unjust. Athens' democracy depended on slavery. Our prosperity may depend on environmental destruction or global inequalities that our descendants will condemn. Historical distance grants clarity we lack about our own moment. This should inspire humility without paralyzing us. We can still strive to create justice and beauty while acknowledging that our understanding is incomplete, that we're surely missing important considerations, that history will likely judge some of what we do harshly. The alternative, refusing to act or create because perfection is impossible, is worse than accepting imperfection and trying anyway. Athens also whispers to us about the connection between freedom and responsibility, between political rights and civic duty. Athenian citizens had extraordinary freedom to participate in governing themselves, but this freedom required work, attention, willingness to serve on juries and in the council, to attend the assembly, to think seriously about collective decisions. Freedom wasn't merely absence of constraint, but active participation in self-governance. Our own democracies struggle with this. We've expanded political rights far beyond anything Athens imagined, extending the franchise to previously excluded groups. But we've also allowed civic participation to atrophy, to become merely voting occasionally for representatives who make decisions without much input from citizens. We have more political freedom in theory, but perhaps less meaningful political engagement in practice. Athens suggests that democracy requires not just rights, but participation, not just freedom from tyranny, but freedom for self-governance. On culture, Athens reminds us that communities can and should invest collectively in art and beauty, that aesthetics are not merely private luxury but public necessity. The building program that created the Acropolis was democratically decided, publicly funded, collectively achieved. It represented a society willing to devote significant resources to creating beauty, to making art that would inspire and educate and bind citizens together through shared aesthetic experience. We've largely retreated from this vision, treating art as primarily market-driven, beauty as subjective preference rather than collective value. But Athens suggests that communities are impoverished without shared beauty, that public spaces and buildings matter not just functionally but aesthetically, that creating art and architecture that expresses common values and aspirations is worth collective effort and expense. Finally, Athens whispers to us about the connection between thought and action, between philosophy and politics, between the examined life and civic engagement. The philosophers who emerged from Athens' culture insisted that the deepest questions about justice, goodness, truth weren't merely abstract, but had practical implications for how we should organize our collective life. Politics wasn't merely about power, but about wisdom, about understanding what justice requires and structuring society accordingly. This integration of thought and action, of philosophy and citizenship, is something we've mostly lost. We separate academic philosophy from political practice, treat ethical questions as distinct from policy questions, assume that wisdom and governance operate in different domains. But Athens suggests they're connected, that good governance requires philosophical reflection, that citizenship can be a form of wisdom rather than merely a mechanism for expressing interests. None of this means we should try to recreate Athens. We can't and shouldn't. The specific forms that Athenian democracy took, the exclusions it practiced, the empire it built, these are not models to imitate, but the aspirations Athens embodied to create political freedom, to pursue beauty collectively, to connect civic life with philosophical inquiry, to believe that ordinary people can govern themselves. These remain valuable and relevant. Athens was one experiment in human possibility, carried out 25 centuries ago in specific conditions that no longer exist. It succeeded in some ways and failed in others. It created extraordinary beauty while depending on terrible injustice. It pioneered democracy while limiting it drastically. It reached toward truth while executing Socrates. All of these contradictions are part of the legacy, all worth remembering and learning from. Perhaps that's what Athens whispers most insistently. That human communities are always works in progress, always incomplete, always mixing achievement with failure, beauty with injustice, wisdom with blindness. The challenge isn't to find a perfect model from the past, but to learn from all the past offers, the successes and the failures, the glories and the shames, and to keep striving to build communities worthy of human dignity, knowing we'll never fully succeed, but believing the attempt matters anyway. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. Through these 2.5 hours we've spent together walking the streets of Pericles' Athens, from the ruins left by Persian fires to the marble rising on the Acropolis, from the assembly debates on the Pnyx to the philosophers' questions in the Agora, from the glory of the Golden Age to the shadows that always accompanied that glory. We've tried to see this extraordinary city honestly, in all its complexity. We began with a simple question. What made Athens in the Age of Pericles so remarkable that we're still discussing it 25 centuries later? The answer, as honestly as I can give it, is that Athens attempted something genuinely difficult and rare, to create a political community based on citizen participation, to make beauty a collective achievement, to pursue wisdom about justice and truth, and the good life not in isolation but as part of civic culture. The attempt was always imperfect, always compromised, always limited by the exclusions and exploitations we've examined, but it was serious and sustained, and it produced achievements that continue to inspire and challenge us. If you found value in this slow drift through ancient history, a like or comment truly helps this channel reach others seeking the same peaceful way to learn. I'm grateful to everyone who has shared their thoughts in the comments, who has suggested topics for future explorations. This community of curious, thoughtful people seeking rest through learning has become something special. Wherever you are in the world right now, in a quiet bedroom as night deepens, in a place where dawn is approaching, in some corner where the present moment feels less pressing than the ancient past, I hope you found some peace in our time together. I hope your breathing has slowed, that your thoughts have settled like dust in abandoned ruins, that your body feels heavy and warm and ready for rest. Look up at the night sky, if you can, or imagine it if you can't. All those stars that shone on Athens 25 centuries ago shine still, their light crossing unimaginable distances to reach us here and now. The Parthenon's marble glowed golden in the light of those same stars. Socrates asked his questions beneath that same sky. The Athenians who built democracy and temple and tragedy looked up at those same distant lights and wondered, as we wonder, about their place in the cosmos, about what endures and what fades, about what human communities can achieve in the brief time we have. They're gone now, all of them. Pericles and Aspasia and Phidias and Sophocles and Socrates and the thousands whose names were never recorded. The democracy they built eventually fell. The empire crumbled. But the questions they asked, the beauty they created, the attempt they made to live freely and nobly and wisely, these echo still across all the silent centuries, perhaps what matters most isn't perfection, but aspiration. Not achieving some final ideal state, but continuing to reach for it despite failures and compromises. Athens reached gloriously and tragically, building democracy on slavery, creating beauty through empire, pursuing truth while excluding most of humanity from the conversation. We inherit that mixed legacy, those achievements and sins, those possibilities and warnings. Sleep well now. Dream of marble columns catching the morning light, of assembly debates under open sky, of plays performed for thousands, of philosophers asking questions in dusty marketplaces. Dream of a city that believed democracy possible, beauty necessary, wisdom worth pursuing. Dream of Athens at its height, that brief golden age when one small city reached toward something larger than itself and almost, impossibly, touched it. Good night. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams filled with marble and philosophy and the voices of citizens long silent. Good night from ancient Athens, whispering still across the darkness, inviting us to remember, to learn, to aspire, to build our own imperfect attempts at justice and beauty and wisdom. Good night.